there is a cost to climate change. It just people don't specifically relate to it. But every time there's a massive typhoon, it impacts us. At some point, we have to start thinking about, are there going to be carbon tariffs that will start to be imposed and the like. And I think getting ahead of the curve, I think, therefore, also helps us avoid some of those potential challenges.
Hello, I'm Noelle Lim on ASEAN Speaks by Maybank Investment Banking Group. In terms of ESG in the Philippines, Ayala Corporation is regarded as the gold standard and is part of the FTSE for Good index. They are taking concrete action to move towards net zero by 2050 and to align with UN Sustainable Development Goals, focusing on climate change and biodiversity, among others. Alberto de Larrazabal, Chief Financial as well as Chief Sustainability Officer at Ayala, joins us to talk about the group's efforts. Thank you, Albert, for making time for us. Ayala Corp is a huge conglomerate, and you're triple-hatting as CFO, CSO, as well as the Chief Risk Officer. What does your appointment mean in terms of how Ayala is approaching sustainability or how it is thinking about it?
We've looked at the various components, whether that be climate, our social commitments, governance policies, I think fairly consistent through time. What we're trying to do now is to put, especially when it comes to the climate side of things, to put a lot more rigor into it. And I think when you look at how best to drive that, the logic of making the CFO, likewise the Chief Sustainability Officer, is so that you embed it in the financial decisions that need to be made. Part of it also is to be able to start working the many benefits that you can get given the emerging ecosystem tied up to sustainability and more specifically to climate initiatives, whether that be in terms of how you communicate it to the investing public, whether that is in the form of preferential credit that is now being generated. But I think more importantly, given that the CFO tends to be a central point of coordination as far as budgets and plans are concerned, it is one easy point of reference, if you like, to be able to ensure that all of the programs that are being developed find its way into the plans and programs with targets and KRAs behind it.
Could you tell us more about this rigor and discipline, something you keep emphasizing?
Right. So there is a science that is needed behind the Paris Agreement. So to get to net zero is a journey that involves numerous steps, very tailor-made to all the individual industries. And so what we've decided to do, together with the announcement or the commitment to net zero, is to take on a consultant who's worked with very reputable and large global institutions to work with us to provide us a framework to be able to measure our emissions, specifically, more importantly, scope 3 types of emissions. And then with that, convert it into interim targets and the programs that are needed to be able to measure, to achieve those interim targets. And clearly, as businesses evolve, our emissions will change and targets will have to be modified. So you need to put it in a framework so that you are getting towards that, you're evolving towards that particular target.
The Ayala Group is committing to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. What is the business case for the group to be net zero?
Now, the business rationale, if you like, is one, we have to address the issues on climate change. If you look at the Philippines, we contribute on a per capita basis half of the global average. And yet, we rank so high in terms of climate risk. So we disproportionately suffer the consequences of this action. And so, it's our home. We've been in the Philippines for the last 100 80 years. And so we do have to pay attention to it. Two, you're starting to see how companies are being favored either by way of preferential credit um, programs or um, better multiples as far as the investing public is concerned. So there's clearly a benefit to this. There is also an avoidance. There is a cost to climate change. It just people don't specifically relate to it. But every time there's a massive typhoon, it impacts us. At some point, we have to start thinking about, are there going to be carbon tariffs that will start to be imposed and the like. And I think getting ahead of the curve, I think, therefore, also helps us avoid some of those potential challenges. It may be initially difficult to justify each and every investment, but you know that you have to go down this path. And the key to is to make it sustainable. It can't be CSR. It needs to find a way into the business logic and the strategies that we execute for ourselves, whether that's in the products that we create, the manner by which we market these products, and the way we basically run the business.
I'd like to get more granular with you about Ayala's Scope 3 emissions, or those that occur in the value chain that are expected to make up the majority of the group's footprint. What are the challenges you are finding in terms of measuring emissions, setting targets, and embedding changes into your processes?
Okay, so to be quite transparent, that process has just begun. We had been focused on Scope 1 and Scope 2. But to your question, when you start to think about some of the industries we're in, whether that's in communications, and now you start to think about all the major telecommunication equipment suppliers globally, the ability to influence what they're doing is a challenge. Now, in that particular area, we're fortunate in that the GSMA, which is the Global Telco Association, is working together with vendors, together with the communication providers to try and address this problem. But you can replicate this across many different fronts when you start to think about building materials, right? Is another example. So we're obviously going to have to work at it. We're going to have to look at which of our vendors, partners on the entire value chain are likewise committing themselves, um, and understand that it won't happen overnight. There are emerging technologies that will have to find its way into mainstream before some of these commitments can be met. So there are many, many dependencies beyond our own individual capability to be able to hit net zero. But having said that, the idea is to keep at it and keep working at it so that that rigor and that discipline is embedded in the way we run our business.
So we are really talking about another 28 years to reach net zero. How realistic is this?
I think that's the answer to that is a process of discovery as we go through it, um, and many technologies that will have to come in. And it's not just us in the Philippines; it's global in nature.
One project that really caught my eye is your project Kasibulan, a
Yes,
reforestation program to protect forests, mitigate greenhouse gas emissions while providing a source of livelihood for
yeah.
villagers. Is it at the stage of generating carbon credits that can be sold back to the Ayala Group, or is
Yeah.
that vision that you are thinking of, or
So
at least selling the credits to a
yeah,
voluntary carbon
yeah, no,
market?
absolutely. It's something that I particularly um, am interested in. Um, so in parallel to trying to reduce our emissions, this one actually hopefully captures carbon. Right? The nice thing about it is it's forestry. It's meant to generate new trees. It is meant to prevent deforestation, but at the same time work with the local community so that they're aligned to the objectives of that effort. we've been working at it for a while. We're at the point where it's close to being commercially launched, in other words, to scale. The hope and intent is that if this can be done to scale successfully, then maybe it is something we can replicate and invite others to join us.
What are the challenges of unlocking the value of this program and really providing a decent enough living for the villagers?
What we have been trying to do is work with the bureaucracy, both the local and national governments. It means working with indigenous peoples, and it will differ from area to area. So what we have done is we have chosen an area where we've gotten a lot of traction and support. And I think what it is we will have to look for other locations where we can get similar type of alignment with the to make this a success.
At what point is it ready to generate carbon credits? Carbon
Well,
credits.
from day one, you're starting to do it. You're planting a cycle where you will be generating more and more credits, and the intent is to initially use it, for our own use. Um, However, you're starting to see situations where there are exchanges being set up, like in Singapore, where you can actually trade these credits. Um, but I think we will probably need everything that we can get. And I think there are similarly situated companies in the Philippines that are looking for ways to be able to participate in this effort to reduce emissions and would also need carbon credits. So hopefully we can translate that into um, people wanting to support and engage us in this type of programs.
There are people who are rather skeptical about the voluntary carbon markets. What's your general view about carbon credit exchanges or market?
It's a useful interim mechanism, but the real target should not be offsets. It should be reductions. Now, offsets does have a role to play because it provides incentives for people to create carbon credits, right? And a market. I think people will always have to resort to some form of carbon offsets because I don't think anybody can totally eliminate all their emissions. But I think the idea is through time that should become less and less as a percentage of your total effort.
How do you see tools like blockchain and cryptocurrencies being part of the solution for Ayala's ESG efforts?
We've not thought of it. One immediate use that comes to mind, at least for blockchain, is the verification of the credits, if that becomes part and parcel of the entire ecosystem. But I think the bigger challenge today is really just in the generation of the credits themselves.
Many traditional companies risk getting left behind if they don't move fast enough in making changes to become sustainable. What are some risks companies need to think about or may tend to overlook in decarbonizing?
So I think the first step in the whole process is very, very senior commitment, all the way to the board. In fact, the board must take on this responsibility as well. And the reason for that is it's difficult. Um, it's so, easy to just say, well, you know what, maybe we don't do it. There's all of these other things we need to address as far as the marketplace and our businesses, etc. So it's so easy to fall back. And so the commitment is important. And it must find its way into people's KRAs all the way up to the board. If you don't have that commitment, that is, in my mind, the single largest risk. Beyond that will become the availability of technologies, the alignment of the value chain to be able to try and drive reductions. Now, I keep reminding people our scope 3 is somebody's scope 1. So if everybody's trying to do their bit, then our scope 3 has some built-in mechanism that people are paying attention to their part.
You mentioned new technologies. Could you elaborate?
When you talk about the steel industry and the way it's currently manufactured, you're talking about green hydrogen. Is that a technology that can be brought to scale so that as they manufacture some of these materials, then there's less emissions tied up to it. So things along those nature. Power, for instance, right? I'll give you a very concrete example. The Philippines. Our total generating capacity is just what is um, needed to be able to supply the requirements. And, we're trying to get the economy kick-started again. And without power, that's going to be a major disaster. Now, a lot of the power in the country is still coal, is still thermal. And so as we try to go through a renewable path towards the energy that we produce, there are still other things like storage. It's not a very efficient generation of power in terms of what the installed is versus what effective uh, power that it generates. So there's a lot of work that's being done on battery storage, and that's improving through time. But that's another concrete example of the challenges we have. So there could be what we call transition technologies, right? And so that's maybe the role that gas plays. If there is a need and the renewables are not in a position due to technology and the like to be able to supply, then can we think about transition technologies such as gas that is clearly less polluting, if you like, generates less emissions as a way of progressing towards that end state? Because not to do that would also have economic implications. So you create a whole different set of problems. It's constantly balancing those trade-offs.
Among the various initiatives Ayala has, which really stands out for you?
There's a whole host, and I think they're unique to the individual industries. And let me just highlight a few things. So obviously, from a energy perspective, right? ASEAN uh, is focusing on building its renewable portfolio, uh, mostly in wind and in solar, as making investments in battery storage facilities to be able to start working that technology, and is taking on significant steps to reduce our capacities coming from coal and thermal. We're looking at energy transition mechanisms. We're working with ADB and our sister company, Bank of the Philippine Islands, to be able to come up with an interesting program to be able to try and accelerate, to fund the acceleration of the winding down of this particular equipment. You got ASEAN totally focused on renewables. You have people like Globe, who has been working with alternative fuel for the cell sites across the country. Unfortunately, power availability is not consistently there as far as the provincial and more far-flung areas, but communication is essential. So they've been working on less polluting type of fuels, fuel cells and the like, to be able to continue to provide that service. As one example, they've committed to work with on developing their science-based targets, which means they're going to expose themselves to that rigor to be able to continue that journey. You think about BPI, and they're got a target set for themselves where they will stop providing support to this particular segments, and not provide loans to coal and thermal after a while. You've got um, the property guys who have been working very much on getting themselves on carbon neutrality for their malls as a first step. So you're seeing many programs across different parts, and the whole idea is to keep working at it to see what else we can be doing across the different members of the group to be able to to work towards our commitments.
I have to ask you this: how do you manage your time?
I have a team of very passionate people in Ayala Corp who help coordinate all of these efforts, and working with South Pole to be able to generate this framework and set of programs that we can now start to communicate to the public, and then start to measure ourselves in terms of our levels of success.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you again for making time for Maybank.
Thank you, Noel. Stay safe.
Alberto de Larrazabal, Chief Financial and Chief Sustainability Officer of Ayala Corporation in the Philippines. I'm Noelle Lim on ASEAN Speaks by Maybank Investment Banking Group.